And here we have everybody's favorite scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Let's have a listen to Neil talking about his opinion slash view, perspective on God.
Do you believe in God?
Me?
Creator?
Yeah, so I'm, the more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might ascribe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all powerful or not all good. I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it. And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence. But we don't, for exactly that reason. So I'm given what everyone describes to be the properties that would be expressed by an all-powerful being in the gods that they worship. I look for that in the universe and I don't find it. So I remain unconvinced. But if you've got some good evidence, bring it, bring it, bring it, okay? And so I don't lead with that information because what I believe should be irrelevant to anyone. It's not about me. It's about the real world.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to say kudos to Neil for that point that he makes at the end, which is that he tends to leave his personal view and opinion on God, religion, faith out of the picture, unless obviously, like here, someone is actually directly probing and asking for it, because I suppose the point he's making is that as an advocate of science, as an ambassador of science, he wants his primary objective is to teach science, to spread awareness and understanding of how things work. And his personal belief on God, on spirituality, whatever it is, doesn't contribute to that. So it's not relevant to his role as a teacher of an ambassador of science. So he doesn't bring it into the conversation. And honestly, I have a lot of respect for that. Now, in terms of the rest of that clip and what he says, I think there's a lot of depth that's clearly missing here. Now, first of all, there are two completely different points that he sort of veers back and forth between, right? So he starts off talking about how presenting an argument against an all-powerful, omnipotent, and benevolent God, right? He presents an argument that the evidence seems to point towards the fact that there cannot be a God that is both all-powerful and benevolent and loving, caring, etc., because then things wouldn't look the way they look. And then says, but if we would get evidence of God, if we would find evidence of God, if we would bump into God, well, okay, then I would accept it, but there's no evidence of the fact that God exists. Now, this is a completely different point. The fact that there isn't evidence of God, well, I mean, we could get way deep into that, but that's not even really where I want to go with this. It's a completely separate point. The fact that God, faith is called faith for a reason because we have faith, we believe, as opposed to having evidence of something, those are two completely different things, and that's true. But that's not a continuation of the point he was making before, which was an argument against the possibility, or what he's presenting as evidence of the fact that there cannot be a God that's both all-powerful and benevolent. And then he veers back into that argument again. So I think it's important just to be clear that there are two completely different conversations here. The fact that there is no evidence of God, and that's why it's called faith and belief, fair point. Point number one. Right? And it would make sense then to continue and say, and so I haven't seen any evidence of God, of the existence of God. It's just belief, it's just faith. I look for evidence, I don't see any. That being said, if I would bump into God, if I would come across evidence, then that would change things. That's one point. Then the argument about the fact that God, as, let's say, the way he puts it, most major religions present God as, or believe in God as, a being that is both all-powerful and benevolent. Clearly, that's not the case. That's a completely separate point. That's a let's call it, the way he puts it, a philosophical argument. That's evidence against God as many people present it. So really, this should be two completely separate conversations, and he's sort of veering back and forth between them as though it's one point when they're two completely different things. Now again, on the, faith versus belief versus fact, a lack of evidence, fair enough. But on the first point, honestly, there is, it's I would say that it is a very, very superficial way of looking at it. In Yiddish, we would say it's kleinkeppeldik, it's small-minded, which is that, look around, we see things that cause pain, they cause suffering. Now, if there is something that is causing pain and suffering, and that is something that would be under the control of God, if God exists, then obviously God is not benevolent, and if God is benevolent, that means that these things are beyond God's control. Because God cannot be both in control of these things that cause pain and suffering, and also benevolent, because then he wouldn't allow things to play out the way they're playing out. And honestly, he actually sort of answers this himself, or gives the evidence of how almost childish, but kleinkeppeldik, small-minded, superficial this view of things is, when he says, if I would bump into the bearded man, right, and obviously he's officially, seemingly using this bearded man, this imagery of the bearded man as, let's say somewhat of a bit of a joke, a bit sarcastically, whatever it is. But the fact that that's the imagery that shows up for him is exactly why he draws this philosophical conclusion that, well, if there is pain and suffering in the world, then either God is not in control of it, or God is not kind. Because if God's in control and kind, then everything would feel nice. And yeah, if God was a bearded man, then that would be a solid argument. But if we think for a second about what does God mean, creator. Now, if God is, if we think of God as, like in a lot of these, mythologies, there are all these different gods, and there's the God in charge of this and the God in charge of that, and these are gods lowercase g. All of these different gods. Yeah, these gods, the way that they're presented in the mythologies are probably more like angels, or, than God, than an actual God, a creator of everything. If we look at, and in monotheism, and this is the way that it's very clear that things are in Judaism, if God is absolute infinity, God is the creator of everything. God didn't just create people and the weather and planet Earth. God created time and space, and continues to create time and space and keep them in existence. God is the creator of reason. God is the creator of logic. God is the creator of the concept of justice. If, we open our minds a little and we think a little bit more flexibly and not just like, oh, God is this bearded man in the sky, and we can accept the things that, he's taking as being absolute and, axiomatic to the fabric of existence, which are logic and reason, etc. If we can accept that those are also creations. God is the origin and creator of logic and reason and justice, etc. And the creator of the human brain and the human mind and the human ability to perceive and understand, then it's no longer difficult to understand and accept that the absolute truth, the truth at the level of, let's say, to whatever extent, we can understand what these words mean, but the truth at the level of God's perception of truth, the absolute truth, God's experience of truth. Experience is the wrong word, but the absolute truth, not just restricted to logic and reason that are creations, but a truth that's bigger than that. And the fact that there are other factors involved that are beyond the reach of the human mind, then I would say that could relieve us of the hubris a little, of thinking that we've got this all down pat, and therefore, if things don't add up at face value to us, at first glance, that means that obviously this whole thing is just wrong. I want to actually share a story of a personal experience on this topic, and that is, as a rabbi, before I was married, I traveled around in the summer. I traveled around to North and South Dakota, and we would go from town to town, city to city, visiting Jews, sitting down, spending time with them, getting to know them, talking about Judaism, Jewish values, etc. Inviting them to do a mitzvah, to put on tefillin, to light Shabbos candles, whatever it was. And there was this one gentleman I'll never forget, who we met in North Dakota, in one of the relatively larger cities, a professor, a deeply, deeply intelligent man, also very funny. And we came to his house and sat down with him, and we had a conversation that was about 4 hours long. And it was a super intense, exhausting, really deep conversation. And he had opened up the conversation saying that he would consider himself agnostic. He said, I'm not arrogant enough to think that I know that there's no God and that I'm an atheist. But he said, I doubt. I don't know God doesn't exist, but I doubt it. And so we had this conversation, and it was a very, it was a deeply connected conversation, and we were really, going back and forth and hearing each other out and hearing where we were coming from and where we were at, and really it was kind of this, almost like a dance, a very exhausting one. And at the end of the conversation, towards the end of the conversation anyways, he says, and this was something that he said just sort of somewhat abruptly, this professor said, maybe the reason that I don't want to believe that God exists, that God is real, is because I don't want to accept that there's something that by definition is beyond the reach of my mind. And that right there is the depth and the wisdom. Now, I'm not saying that that is therefore proof that God exists. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that right there is a step deeper beneath this childish, klein-keppeldick, superficial way of looking at things where, 1 + 1 = 2, this is what I see at face value, therefore, obviously God doesn't exist. It's acknowledging the fact that maybe there is a picture that's bigger than what we see. It's not evidence that God exists, but it's an openness to the fact that maybe things are a little more complex than what we see at face value and what we understand at face value. And that's the thing that I think Neil is really missing here.